one of your early speakers. And I'm sorry I'm appearing at a time when the relations with China and the United States are so tense. I wish I were appearing at a better time. I thought I would say just a few words about my background to give you a little more feel of what my perspective is. I got my PhD in sociology and psychology, and then I studied Asia after that, first going to Japan and then to China. The first time I went to China was in 1973. I had the good fortune to be chosen to be part of the first American scientific delegation from the American Academy. So I went in 1973. I went to Beida and we met Zhou Peiyuan. We also met some Red Guards. And we also had a chance to meet Zhou Enlai, that delegation. So then I came back to Harvard, and I always felt I was catching up because unlike all of you, I didn't have a chance to study in China and really get a feel as a student. So I always felt behind. But I've had a lot of good opportunities. I spent some time in Guangdong. I started out because in the 70s, we couldn't go to China. Mainland China, we could only go to Hong Kong. So I started in Hong Kong, and the best information we had was about Guangdong. So that's why I started learning about Guangdong and was at the Guangdong province in the Jingji Weiyanhui. I was attached to them for almost a year to get a feeling of the province. And then I came back, and at Harvard, I've been teaching about China and Japan. When I retired from Harvard in 2000, I tried to decide what's the most important thing to explain to Americans. And I felt the most important thing to explain was the rise of China. And from what I believed at that time, I think the biggest explanation really came during 改革开放 at the time of 1978, led by Deng Xiaoping. So I spent 10 years learning about that, and I had wonderful cooperation from Chinese friends. I got to know all three of Deng Xiaoping's daughters, and I got to know a number of other officials, and I had the very good fortune of getting very good cooperation. I stayed in Beijing mostly at that time at the Dangdai Jingguo Yanjiaoshuo. And one of Chen Yun's former secretary, Zhu Jiamu, was the director at that time. So that also helped me have a lot of contacts and get the background. So I feel I was very fortunate that I had good cooperation, good information. And so I spent 10 years and I wrote that book. Then after that book came out in 2010, I was trying to decide what else I want to work on. I'm a workaholic. My wife thinks I work too much and all I care about is my work. But in 2010, when I finished that, I tried to think, what's the most important thing that I could contribute? And I felt because I had friends both in China and Japan, and the relations were really at their very worst in 2010. There were some ships that bumped into each other. And as a result of that, their relationship became very tense. And so I felt that if a Chinese wrote about Japan or their relations, the Japanese might be a little suspicious. If a Japanese wrote about it, the Chinese would be suspicious. But maybe an American who was a friend of both sides and knew both sides and had written a bestseller on Japan in Japanese and a bestseller in China in Chinese, said I might have some hope of trying to help heal the relationship. So that's why I wrote this book about China and Japan. Also in my career, another good fortune I had was from 1993 to 5, I worked in the US government. I was the National Intelligence Officer for East Asia. So I had a chance to get some sense of how governments worked. And since that time, I've taken an interest. I don't have clearances now, and I'm not a government official, but my experience in government gave me a sense of how much information governments have and how they work. Now what I thought I'd do is spend a few minutes telling about the period as I see it, when China surpassed Japan in 2010. I could say it's 2008 to 2012. 2010, the World Bank said that the Chinese economy had passed that of Japan. In 2008, of course, because the Olympics were so successful and because of the Western financial crisis, there was a great deal of confidence in Beijing that they were going to soon surpass Japan. In 2010, their economy was bigger. And their relationships went through really a terrible period. Now, there are various explanations of why that relationship was so bad at that time. But I think underneath it was the fact that China was again surpassing Japan to be the dominant power in East Asia. When I was working on this book on China and Japan, I spent about 7-8 years before the book came out. I believe that from the year 600, but in the Sui dynasty, when the Japanese first started sending missions to China to learn about Chinese civilization, until about 838, that was a period they sent many missions in the Sui and Tang to visit Chang'an to learn about Chinese culture, that all the basis of Japanese culture came from China. But in the period of 1895 until, I would say, 2010, roughly 2010, Japan had the upper hand. It was a period of from 1895, as I say, to about 115 years that Japan had the upper hand. If you start with the Sino-Japanese War, the Jiawu Zhangzheng in 1894-95, I think in some ways that was a much bigger shock than the coming of the Opium Wars, the French and the English. If you look what happened immediately after 1895 and 1898, right away you had the year of reform. You had then you got rid of the old examination, the Kaoju system, and then the 2011 revolution. I think that the shock of Japan, that little pipsqueak of a country with 4 little islands overtaking China in the Sino-Japanese War, was just a huge shock. And I think, therefore, the impact, in a way, came much faster after that time than after the Opium Wars. And from that time, Japan imposed very heavy conditions. As you know, it occupied Taiwan, and it required huge indemnities. And it helped, after the Boxer Rebellion, keep order in Beijing. One thing, my shorthand way of talking to Japanese and Chinese about how they feel about each other, is I tell my Japanese friends, you don't know how to say, I'm sorry enough. You haven't acknowledged all the horrors you've done. Individually, they will often acknowledge occasionally their speeches, but they don't do it as thoroughly as the Germans did. And they don't talk as much about the horrors of 1894-95. They don't talk about what they did in Manchuria all that much. And they don't talk that much about World War II. They do apologize, but it's often in a formal way and not far enough. So I tell my Japanese friends that they haven't learned to say, I'm sorry enough. And I tell my Chinese friends, they haven't learned down to say Japan, thank you enough. Because if you look at the period after 1895 until 1931, when the war broke out in Manchuria, in that period of time, the Chinese learned a tremendous amount from Japan. And they had so many things in all fields that they learned from Japan in that period. Of course, Sun Yat-sen went there, Kang Youwei, Liang Qiqiao, and they developed a lot of the background and work for the 1911 revolution. But they also studied in every subject. One field, of course, they learned was in the military. And not only did Chiang Kai-shek go, but in the 1930s, when they had the meetings of the Kuomintang military leaders, most of them were graduates of Japanese military academies. One of my favorites is Zhang Baili, who in 1906, in the Japanese National Military Academy, the number one student of that academy was not a Japanese, it was Zhang Baili. And he became very friendly with the Japanese generals, and he could see that there was going to be a war, and they would invade and had higher technology and better organization, and that China would not be able to resist. So he said the only way to defeat the Japanese is a protracted war. Later, of course, Mao Zedong wrote about the protracted war, but the person who really developed that idea, the way to defeat Japan would be to wear them out. And Chiang Kai-shek took his advice, and that therefore did play a key role in the policy in which China was able to, in the end, wear out the Japanese. And from their point of view, they won the war. From the American point of view, of course, Americans think we won the war. It was through all of the bombing and the atomic bomb, and then, of course, the Russians enter into the war. But there's no question that wearing out the Japanese played a huge role. Now, in the period of time, so I think that in that early period, the Chinese in every field had learned a tremendous, not only in military affairs, even the words like 社会主义 and 共产党, those words originally were translated from Japanese. There was a Japanese professor at Kyoto University named Kawakami Hajime, who wrote books and translated on Marxism into Japanese. And a lot of the early Chinese learned from Japanese. And of course, not only did people from the Kuomintang, but Zhou Enlai also studied in Japan. And then not only in the field of politics and learning theories about the West, of course, scientific fields and medicine, literature. I think the Chinese modern literature got an awfully big start from Japan. As you know, Lu Xun went originally to Japan to study medicine, but he ended up deciding that he wanted to write literature to wake up the country. But not only Lu Xun, but Mao Dun and Yu Dafu and many other Chinese writers, so that the modern Chinese literary movement of the 20s, I think, was overwhelmingly people from Japan. So when I say I don't think that China has done enough to say thank you, I think that's part of it. But I think also after 1978, China learned an awful lot Japan. Japan was very helpful, although they didn't give reparations, and Chiang Kai-shek had allowed them to get away without paying reparations. But they did play a role in helping out China. Deng Xiaoping was smart enough in early 78 to know that before China could really take off, they would need the help of the United States and Japan. And so in October 78, I think already he knew that at the plenum coming up in December, where it really began, he already knew before that something like that, he was going to have responsibility. So in October, he went to Japan. There were 4 things that he did there that I think already he could see the important role that they would play in Chinese development. One is he visited the Japanese steel plant at Kimitsu. And this plant at Kimitsu became the model for Baoshan. And so that before that, I visited when I was in China in the 70s, some old steel factories that were almost like handicraft steel factories, where I saw people shoveling coal into the furnace to make steel. And it was so different from the modern factories that they developed after Baoshan that revolutionized steelmaking. As you know now, about half the world and half the steel in the world is made in China. But at that time, there were no modern steel plants, so that was really very important. Another thing he did, he wrote on the Shinkansen. Shinkansen, as the Japanese say, the fast train. And of course, there were no fast trains at that time. Now, again, about half the fast train track in the world is in China. But Deng Xiaoping rode on the Shinkansen, and he could see that that was something that China would want to learn. He also visited Nissan, Zhichan. Nissan was an interesting company. Not only did they make automobiles, and at that time they were just introducing robots, but when Japan was in the Northeast in the 1930s, Zhichan played a very big role of Japanese industry at that time in the Northeast. So they had a root in China, but that they were a model for modern automobile industry. He also went down to Osaka, Daban, and there he met Matsushita Konosuke, Sung Xia. And at that time, of course, they didn't have computers or some of the new electronics, but they did have television, and they did have electronic calculating machines. And he wanted to learn from Sung Xia, so he met him personally, Matsushita Konosuke, and so learned about modern electronics. So in all those fields, Japan played a very key role, and JETRO played a role in getting all those things started. Well, to skip ahead now, the 2008 to 2012 period, I think that was a very shocking period for the Japanese, and it was a very tense period. I think a lot of the Chinese, and this is an American perspective, and maybe not every Chinese would agree, but I think there was an excitement about the new power. It's in a way analogous, I thought, to a nouveau riche, that people who suddenly became rich get very excited. And I think that a lot of the Chinese felt for so long we've had to bow down to the Japanese, and now we don't have to bow down anymore. And so the Japanese went through quite a tough period, I think, from 2008 to 2012. By about 2014-16, China decided it better stabilize relationship. And of course, China has still sent ships and airplanes to the Senkaku Diaoyudao area. And in that area, things are still quite tense. But I think that in a way, that worst period of tension between China and Japan has already passed. I think it was in that period from 2008 to 2014, before things began to stabilize. The situation is still tense. I think if Xi Jinping were able to go to Japan, as we hoped he would this year, if it had not been for coronavirus, I think that relations would be distinctly improved. But even without that trip, I think that relations with China and Japan, they're not happy relations. The people in both countries do not have very positive feelings. They're mostly negative feelings. But it's not as tense and not as hostile. The Japanese are readier to be polite and not to say the nasty kind of things that Trump and his administration say about China. So I think in that situation, we have a situation where China surpassed Japan, went through a tense period in the transition, and things smoothed off. Now, the way I see what's happening now with the United States is a much tougher and more complicated situation. As you know, Americans are very confident. And I think after World War II, once the Cold War with the Soviet Union was over and the Soviet Union fell apart, in early 1990s, and Eastern European fell apart. Then the only power really in the world was the United States. And I think the United States was arrogant at that time. I think, fortunately, Nixon and Kissinger, at the time when they were forming relations, when Kissinger first went in 71 and then Nixon went in 72, I think they saw China as an ally against the Soviet Union and China as a friend who might help get rid of the Vietnam problem for the United States. So I think there was a strategic reason, but I think that also there was a willingness to try to help China modernize. And I think when Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1978, he realized how important education was. He had been in France from 1920 to 1925. And even though he could not afford to attend a university, he could see that being there and absorbing the culture and learning how a modern country did it could be very helpful to people who Zhou Enlai was there at the time, Ye Rongzhen, Chen Yi were there. There were a lot of Chinese who were there who later came back to play a very important role, realized that foreign learning was very important to develop. And the United States was quite proud and confident and felt that we could afford to help out another country. So I think that the United States during that time period was really quite generous. And when Chinese went back to China and started forming factories, when Deng Xiaoping allowed private enterprises to start first the Getihu and then later bigger enterprises and allowed them to develop. I think Americans felt that that was an opportunity. And when China began to build factories, it took a while to get up to quality. And they were learning from the Japanese as well as from the Americans. I remember in the 1980s when I was in Guangdong, going to some factories and they had big signs which Guanli, the urban Guanli, they were studying Japanese management practices and they were modernizing on the basis of what they were learning from Japan. But they, of course, they were also learning from the United States. And I think at that time, there were a lot of people who were quite happy with the results of American investment in China and China's growth of industry because it was providing work opportunities for Chinese. It was providing opportunities for young scientists and engineers and managers to learn from foreign companies. And of course, American companies were making money too. American financiers were investing. I think, I don't want to get too deep into America's problems, but I think America did not go from the industrialization era into the service era very well. I don't think our national policies were very wise. I think that when we moved to the service economy, we were too much interested in helping the shareholder, the stockholder, not the person, not the shareholder. The person who owns stock would make a lot of money, but we didn't find enough way to spread the wealth more equally. At the industrial period, I think we had a more equal distribution of wages, and our society was healthier at that time, and that our transition to the service sector was not nearly as successful. But I think with our relation with China in those early years, because we were investing in Chinese industry, our companies were doing well, and the American consumer gained. I think at the time, the American political leaders in Washington didn't realize the adjustment that was required from the worker, and they didn't realize how bad it was going to be for society to have so many people in the working sector who had formerly worked for a regular job in a factory, and suddenly, as a service worker working part-time without any regular compensation, without any Social Security, and with wages that were too different from those of us who had a better life in the United States. So when I try to understand what happened when Trump got elected, I think that's part of the background, that it was the United States did not manage that process well, and that we had so many people who felt that they were not taken into consideration when the big political leaders and the rich people in Wall Street were making money. And I think that's the background of why Trump rose. I think at Harvard, if I say are there any people I know at Harvard who support Trump? There may be some, but I don't personally know them. I think it's that one-sided. I think among the students and the faculty, they feel he's been the worst president we've ever had. He's taken us out of the international field. He hasn't handled the coronavirus well. He likes to pretend that he has good relation with a top leader in various countries, even with Kim Jong-un in North Korea, and he pretends he has a good relation with Xi Jinping. But I think that he doesn't rely on experts. He doesn't have a sound policy, and he has made things very worse. I think the trade war has turned out to be very disappointing for the United States. There's some good articles, I think, have come out recently by specialists in the United States. There's one named Ryan Haas, who just has an article examining the results of Trump's policy toward China. It's been terrible for the United States, as well as terrible for the relationships between China and the United States. Now, on the question of why the relationships came so bad, in a way, I think it's a natural competition. China has done well, and China is a competitor. But in the United States, as you know, when we have sports teams, we in the Red Sox and the Boston Red Sox have a rivalry with the Yankees, but there are rules about how it's done, and there's a good sportsmanship, and we congratulate the winner, and we don't have such a nasty feeling of hatred toward the other side. But I think in China, it's now developed, and I think it's gotten worse because a lot of politicians have mismanaged the relationships. But I think there, of course, as you know, there are some underlying issues. China is now very competitive, and in a lot of industries now, the United States is not as strong as it was. There's also a feeling that China has not played fairly, that we have been an open society, and that we have rules about how you take intellectual property from somebody else. But China has taken a lot of intellectual property there without following rules, or even if recently there are courts that rule on this, they don't make the payment so large that it really hurts the company who is taken. And as you know, there were a lot of American companies that set up factories that had in China, where you had a Chinese manager who, after a few years, formed his own company that was competitive with the American company. So from the point of view of the American company, they took the secrets that we had developed that over a longer period of time with a lot of money, and they were using to compete against us. So I think in addition to the success of China, it's a feeling that was not entirely done fairly, and that the opportunity is not fair. And then, as you know, in the United States, in the last couple decades, well, I would say clear back to the Nixon period, if you had issues coming up with China, I think there were two groups of Americans that supported good relations with China. One were business groups, and the other were intellectuals and people who had intellectual exchanges. And both were doing pretty well. But in the last few years, even though some American businesses have still stayed in China and are still doing well and making money, I think the general feeling of businessmen is that there's not as much money to be made, that the Chinese are now that they're able to compete in a lot of sectors, they're being very tough on American firms, and that the state enterprises and the government often decides in China in favor of Chinese firms and not the Americans. So from the point of view of a lot of American businessmen, it's not just that China is successful, it's that they're not playing fair. And for Americans, fair play is very important. And so there is a feeling among businessmen, and they can complain that China is not competing fairly. Among many intellectuals, of course, the fact is that now China in the last several years has gotten much tighter. And our intellectual friends in China used to be more open, are not now so open. And the strictures on what you can say are much tighter. And that the open intellectual environment that had begun to develop under people like Hu Yaobang are not there under Xi Jinping. And so the American intellectuals now, particularly since coronavirus, of course, we don't have opportunities to deal with Chinese intellectuals. I'm happy to say that a small number of us still have intellectual friends in China that we do communicate with and do communicate with fairly regularly. We Americans feel that our Chinese friends are being a little cautious in what they say. They don't want to speak quite as frankly as they could a few years ago, and that inhibits our intellectual exchange. But I think as a whole, the American scholars who have studied China still want very much to have good relations with China, and are very sorry that we can't, and are very critical of our government, as well as they're critical of the crackdown in China. But it is a situation of much tighter relationships. Also, as you know, in journalism, the American journalists have been much under tight control. You probably know that the person at the White House now is in charge of Chinese studies as Matt Pottinger. And Matt Pottinger, I happen to know him. I'm not a close personal friend, but I do know him. He was a Wall Street Journal correspondent, and he was trying to cover some dissidents in China. And one time he was invited to a place and roughed up physically by some guys who didn't like the articles he was writing. So that had a big impact on his thinking. It's not the way journalists should behave. And when Trump was looking for people who knew about China and who shared some of his conceptions, he drew on people like Matt Pottinger. I think the scholars in the United States who studied China want very much to return to better relations. We're very critical of the Trump administration. We hope that Biden will do better. And I am personally one of those who's writing articles now with some other scholars, trying to encourage a new administration, which we frankly hope will be the Biden administration, to have somewhat better relations. We aren't under the illusions that things are suddenly going to get better. They're not going to go back to the wonderful days of the 1980s when we had such good relations. But we hope to be reasonable competitors. In our view, we have to manage these difficulties. As you know, Americans are very complicated people with many different kinds, and we're often very divided. I'm happy to say that as a whole, Americans are quite open, and I hope that you found the relations are good. When I was asked by the Chinese Student Association at Harvard this year to give a speech, I gave a speech saying that we ought to be welcoming to the Chinese students and make them feel comfortable. One of my friends sent a copy of my speech to President Bacow of Harvard, And he wrote me a very nice note saying he agreed with that he wants us to be welcoming and to keep things open. And I had said in my letter, in my talk to the Chinese students, that as far as I knew, everyone I knew at Harvard was happy to have Chinese students here. And it was good for the university and wanted to be nice to them. And President Bacow wrote back in the note to me saying he found the same thing, that all the people he knew at Harvard were quite welcoming of Chinese students. Now, there may be individual problems that people run into, but I think as a whole, that's the attitude. So let me just conclude my talk by saying that I hope things will calm some under President Biden. I hope Biden wins, and that looks at reason for optimism now. And if he does, I think we can be somewhat more optimistic that things will not get out of hand. But as you know, there are a lot of Chinese who feel very confident now. We see some people we call wolf warrior diplomats who are being very tough. And there's some Americans who want to behave in the same way. But I think that there are also a lot of reasonable people on both sides. And I'm happy to say that even in these worst of times, when relations are so bad, there's still a lot of friends of mine who are having relations with colleagues in China and keeping those up. They're not advertising them, but they're going on because there are a lot of people on both sides who have very good relations. And I think of all of you as bridge builders. When I talked to the Chinese students at Harvard, I told them some of you will stay, some of you will go back. I think whether you stay or whether you go back, you're a bridge builder because you understand both sides. And it's in our interest, it's in your interest, it's my personal interest to have very good bridges and make them work. So I'm sure your association is doing all you can to help in keeping those bridges open. So thank you very much. And I'll be happy to answer questions or make comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Volgo. That is very thought-provoking and very, very insightful. We do have a lot of questions coming in right now, but before I just read those questions, I just wanted to say I remembered one sentence from your latest book, that when you actually described the relationship between China and Japan, you said the economics is hot, but the politics is cold. So you hope that at least the politics could be warm. I think that's a wishful thinking for not only Japan and China, but also, U.S. and China as well. Let's hope at least both the economics and politics could at least be lukewarm, if not hot.
Thank you. I agree completely.
Yep. All right. So we do have a lot of questions. I apologize first. We may not be able to get to every one of the questions, but hopefully we can hit, certain types of questions. I've actually bucketed those questions into three broad categories. The first category is actually the bilateral relationship between U.S. and China, which I think you've talked quite a lot about. But what do you think is the root cause of the escalation of the U.S.-China tension right now? And what do you think is going to be the ultimate solution for a major Sino-U.S. conflicts?
I think they have gotten a lot worse during the Trump era because of bad management on our side. And I think from the great confidence that some of the Chinese have. Some of my American diplomat friends tell me when they meet some Chinese diplomats, the word they use is arrogant. You could use a nicer word and say they're proud and confident and patriotic. But to some American diplomats, it feels like they're being talked down to now by some Chinese diplomats who feel they're more confident. So I think it's Chinese success and some of the other factors I mentioned are part of the background. But I think the immediate cause has to do with the Trump administration and the lack of professionalism. He hasn't relied on diplomats. He's relied more on our military than on our diplomats for our international policies. And therefore, the usual exchanges of dealing with issues, the day-to-day handling of problems has not gone well. And that the United States has withdrawn from international organizations. It's not only China, but I think the relations with Canada and European countries are all not as good as they were. So I think a lot of the reasons why in the last 3 years it's initiated by America, but I think also Chinese there's some confident Chinese, and I think that the tightness of China the last say 8 or 10 years since about 2012, the tightness of the policy, the secrecy. Of course, Xinjiang and Hong Kong have made things worse, and I think a lot of Americans have felt that the Chinese government does not respect human rights, and I think the news about the Uyghur in Xinjiang as well as Tibet, and then Hong Kong, the demonstrators. I think the feeling in the United States is that has been handled very badly. And that's not the kind of country that we want to be friendly with. So I think those are the things that have made it get so much worse the last 3 years.
Great. The second question is, it's amazing fact that you have witnessed a major course of rising China. Speaking of keeping the bridge open, what would be your top 3 advice to the future presidents of America about China?
First of all, we need high-level dialogues at a frank level, and we need to use diplomats. So I think right now we already have pretty good understanding between military people on the two sides to prevent accidents. I think that's very, very crucial and very urgent. But my understanding is there have been talks in a place like the South China Sea on how to avoid accidents that might lead to something worse. So I think dialogue is very important. Second is I think we need to work together on economic cooperation. I think there are some areas that are going to be hard to avoid decoupling. I think in national security, and I think in the United States there's great worry that Chinese, by tapping in to secrets, will make our military and much more vulnerable, and that they're very worried that China, with advanced technology, companies like Huawei that could tap into our technology would lead to a collection of secrets. And then, of course, the Chinese are worried about the United States doing the same way. So I think we need some understanding on those issues. But in other areas, I think we should not have decoupling. And I think that companies, we're inexperienced. It's a whole new era. How as a country do we find ways of protecting our secrets? Take our universities, for example. Now we've had some visits to Harvard by people in the security field who worry that some Chinese scientists are stealing secrets. Now, if some of those are military secrets, of course, any nation, in China, the United States, any nation would want to defend against those secrets. But how do you go about it that protects the freedom of the 99% where that's not a problem? Mm-hmm. And I think we're not experienced in that. So I think that's another area, is how to manage those areas of economic competition and to come back to have a lot more decoupling. And thirdly, I think we do need to have more intellectual exchange. I think we need to open ways. And here, I think China has a job to do, is maybe even more than we do, because they've made it so difficult for people to feel free to speak out openly. And they've made it so difficult for foreigners now to go to China and express their opinions freely without getting their Chinese friends in public in trouble. So I think those are you asked for three. Those would be my top three.
Great. That's awesome. And I know you talked a little bit about, you think it's much likely that we will have a Biden win, and it seems that a lot of the audience are very curious whether you think the policy will be different, especially, Chinese policy towards China would be different under a Biden administration, or do you think it's going to be more or less the same?
Well, for one thing, I think it will be much more predictable. And I think they would want to have. Now we have no real high-level talks between officials, and before Trump, of course, under Obama, we had frank talks between very high-level leaders. Mm-hmm. So I think there would be a resumption. Of course, Biden cannot say that now because the mood against China is very negative. Mm-hmm. And he cannot say that he wants to have a lot more talks. Mm-hmm. But my suspicion is that knowing the kind of person he is, and since he did know Xi Jinping when they were both the number two in their countries, they had some contact. So I think there's a basis of contact. And I think there will be some more frank and competitors can talk as competitors, mm-hmm. but that doesn't have to be enemies. It can be competitors. It can be suspicion, but it can be, under some kind of control. So I think that will happen. I think also that Biden, of course, will want to resume American participation in international organizations like WTO, WHO, and the Paris climate talks, certainly the Paris climate talks. And I think on all those, China is ready to take part. So I think we could start in those areas which are not close to political, but where it's so obviously in the interest of both countries to work together. We have now at Harvard, as you may know, a group of people who are working with Beijing on climate issues. Mm-hmm. And they're doing joint research, and they've had a lot of exchange. And that can be lifted up government levels. It's not happening at government levels, but I think there's already a good basis for that. So I think a second thing that would happen would be in those areas that are not close to military and so forth, that we will have a greater degree of cooperation. And I think that, as you know, there are many Chinese who have studied in the United States, who've gone back in various high positions. I think would be ready to take part in those. And I think even on coronavirus, we have a chance that there's some people in China and the United States are already working together. One of my friends at Harvard School of Public Health, Bill Xiao, who just retired from the School of Public Health a couple of years ago, and his successor, Wei Yip, they have done a lot of work with Chinese counterparts, and I think they are already still in contact. And I think that can be maybe bounced up to a little higher level. I think there would be some increase in that. I think on science, there'll be some areas we can cooperate. I think to get together on military issues, I think that the best we can hope in the early stages of a year or two is to avoid accidents and to avoid misunderstandings. I think right now I would say the Taiwan thing is a bit dangerous because there's some people in Congress who don't realize how sensitive Beijing is to the Taiwan issue, and that if they try to move toward making Taiwan an independent country, how risky that is. I think that there's a good chance that those people could quiet down. We would still support Taiwan and be friendly, but I think there's a difference between being friendly to Taiwan and giving it encouragement to go independent. And I would hope that the Biden administration would make that difference. So I don't have any secrets. Biden hasn't asked me. I have met some of the people who are working on the Biden campaign, but I don't have any secrets. But knowing from the thinking of friends I knew in Washington and friends I still know, that's my best guess.
Great. You actually already talked about my next question a little bit, because a lot of our audience are very curious about if you have to assign a probability of a military confrontation between U.S. and China, whether it's in the South Sea or in Taiwan, as you mentioned, how likely do you think we will have something very serious here?
Well, I'll give you my 2 cents, and you may have different opinions. I think the Chinese are very cautious. Mm-hmm. And they realize that the American military is very strong. And I think the Americans are now going to, we're still going to have so-called freedom of navigation, means sending a lot of planes and ships into the South China Seas. I think the Chinese are going to be very cautious in starting anything. I don't think the United States wants to start anything. I think China getting stronger, I would worry more about 10 years from now than I would worry about now. That's my evaluation, because I think that as long as the Chinese feel that the American military is so strong, it's true that if there were to be some kind of quick battle in the South China Sea or in the East China Seas, because China is located so close, it can get so many resources that America are too far away. So the immediate first few hours, I think the United States would have trouble. But the United States has such overwhelming force that I think the Chinese would be very cautious. So I think that in the next few years, if I had to say probability, I would say it's very low. But it's enough to worry about, and it's enough for high-level officials to talk about, to say how we would avoid it. And I think there have been already some talks. Mm-hmm. I think that there has to, if I had a best case scenario, it would be the Chinese and the Americans talk about the South China Sea, and that we realize that this is neighborhood of China, and that we don't need to have military tensions there. That they can be open for the world, and that over the next few years, it is close to China. China has more interest in that area, that we can avoid any kind of conflict.
Great. We've talked so much about U.S. and China. It's probably time for me to move on to our second broad category, which is regarding China's domestic issues like Hong Kong and Xinjiang. So, Professor Vogel, you have been in Hong Kong multiple times. You've also visited Hong Kong last year during the demonstration period. What is your view of demonstration in Hong Kong in the latest political development in Hong Kong? And what type of role do you think Hong Kong plays in this U.S. and China escalated conflict?
I think Hong Kong I think that China has not managed Hong Kong well. As you know, my background was sociology. And I think about the people in Hong Kong. The way I see Hong Kong society is there are a lot of bright mainland students who wanted to come to Hong Kong in the last few years. And perhaps you were one of those who went to Hong Kong University. If you consider out of 1.3 or 1.4 billion people an awful lot of smart people who thought Hong Kong was a good place to go. Mm-hmm. And so if you take a population of 7 million and you say how many brilliant people there are quite a few brilliant people, but you say out of a 1.4 billion, and a lot of those go to Hong Kong, then I think a lot of the local people feel that the best positions at Gangda and at Zhongwen Daxue, a lot of the best positions have gone to those in the mainland. So I think there is and then if I were a company in Hong Kong, and I wanted to do business, of course, with mainland, where the main business places are, I would want somebody who can deal with the mainland. So somebody who spoke Mandarin naturally instead of after learning Cantonese, learning Mandarin, and who grew up in the mainland, would be somebody I would probably hire before a lot of the bright young local people. So I think a lot of the bright young local people, although it's taken on a political covering, I think underneath there are the social things. Then there's another thing, I think within Hong Kong, a lot of the people who 30 years ago were manufacturers, of course, have moved manufacturing to mainland, and they make their money through renting. So they charge huge rent. It's a very stable source of income. Because so many people who come to Hong Kong, they charge very high rents. So if you're a local person and you have trouble getting into, you're a bright young person, 20 years old, you're fairly bright, you get past college, and you're looking for a good job, you want to get married, and the rents are so high you can't afford a decent place, you can't get a good job. And then besides that, your freedoms aren't going to be as great as they used to be. There's a lot of reason for dissatisfaction. So what I think the leader, so I think, in other words, a lot of the rich people in Hong Kong who are making money and have worked with Beijing very closely have not been at the forefront in solving the social and economic problems of Hong Kong, and have not given enough support to the students and have not found a way to express their opinion. I think some of the people who were protesting were not handling the situation very well either. But I think that the politics was not well done before. I think that if mainland China leaders and the leaders of Hong Kong had worked together to find ways of not allowing rents to go so high, building out a lot more housing more quickly and making lower price, finding more employment opportunities, and had given some voice to the local people, it wouldn't have gotten so bad. I'm afraid we're in for a very tense period in Hong Kong. I think that by mainland sending in people who can keep peace, that's going to arouse the reaction of people all over the world. And it's possible they can keep down the demonstrations, but I think the tensions are going to remain very high. And I hope there would be some wise people in the mainland who can find better ways to handle the social problems in Hong Kong and can find ways to get a lot more housing quickly at low price, can find new economic opportunities for local people. But I think there are those underlying problems. So that's my quick view of Hong Kong.
Great. You mentioned about how China handled Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong, and some of the concerns on human rights violation. One of the audience says, curious to hear your thought on this. Would you classify China as repressive regime as the mainstream does? Why or why not? By what standard?
I think that they have been repressive of the Xinjiang, from what I know. I'm not a specialist. I do have some American friends, scholars, who've been studying Xinjiang, and are not allowed to go there anymore, not allowed to have any contact with Uyghurs. I visited there 10 years or so ago, And, I didn't realize at that time, just seeing people in the streets, how tense relations were between the Uyghurs. I think they're more enlightened policies. They could have given more leeway to the Uyghurs than the crackdown. If I were in Beijing now and a high leader, I would be worried, that in such a huge country, how to keep order. And I can understand why high-level communist officials looking at what happened in the Soviet Union and looking what happened in Eastern Europe feel that the only way to do is to have tight control. I wish that there were people now who would be like Hu Yaobang. I think of as a kind of person who would have tried to find a way of granting more freedom and more opportunity and somehow keeping peace even while allowing more and making those minority groups feel more comfortable. The United States did not do a good job of handling our American Indians, and we did a lot of bad things in handling blacks in the past. I think as a whole, in the last few decades, we've been trying to improve the relations with the blacks, but you see how hard that is. I think in China, there would be ways of giving more opportunities to the Tibetans and to the Uyghur that perhaps could have led to a different result where the leaders didn't feel they had to crack down so hard. I think that those are the views, I would say, not just of me personally, but I would say of a liberal American looking at those situations. On the other hand, as a China specialist who's seen the difficulty of uniting China since the 19th century, I can understand why some leaders who feel that the only way to keep order is to crack down. It's too bad, and I think it's not going to win China friends throughout the world to do it that way. But I think that's the way it is.
Thank you so much, Professor Bogo. I think it's time for our third broad category, which is the trilateral relationship of U.S., China, and Japan. If the U.S. continues to treat China as a rival in East Asia, what role do you think Japan is likely to play in the new dynamic? Will Japan align more closely with the U.S. to contain China, or maneuver to allow itself to have more flexibility for ease the relationship with China, or any kind of other approach, do you think?
Japanese are much more polite to Chinese than Americans are. And so when Trump yells at China, the Japanese leaders are much more cautious, and they know what horrible things they've done in World War II, and I think there is some sense of guilt because of that. But I think also they know what happened after 1992 when China had the Aigochi Yundong. And during that time, there were a lot of movies about World War II. And there were a lot of movies about horrible Japanese. And I would go to Beijing at that time and turn on the TV. And it was not difficult to find a World War II movie where the Japanese were behaving pretty bad. So during that period, the Japanese watched those movies, and they watched the Chinese ships in near the Diaoyudiao, Senkaku, they attacking. So they don't feel very comfortable. So I think, and the Japanese know they can't keep up with China in military expenses. So I think at a military level, the Japanese are going to want to work with the United States and to be able to rely on it. At the same time, I think they are readier to work with China and have a deeper basis for having friendly relations with China than does the United States. There are a lot of Japanese who learn Chinese. The Japanese trading companies, it's a very interesting institution. They have like 10 offices, or 8 or 10 offices in different parts of China. And the people who are there intend to stay. And they often not only know Mandarin, but the local dialect and have good relations with local people. So when a Japanese company goes in to those areas, it can work with one of those trading companies. So that gives them a good base for continuing to find economic opportunities. And I think also the Japanese companies are less likely to give away high technology secrets. If I were an American manager in China and I were judged on how much profit I made next quarter, I might be willing to give away a few technology secrets if I got market share. And I think American companies have been readier to do that than Japanese. So I think Japanese have often kept their technology. They're in there for a long term. They're not as concerned with short-term profits. So I think all those reasons give them a better basis. In addition, now, because they're physically close and transport is so good, a Japanese businessman from Tokyo or Osaka, if it weren't for the coronavirus, could fly to Beijing or Shanghai in the morning, have lunch, do business, come back in the evening, all in one day. And I think that has made for much easier communication between Japanese. I think there are also a few cultural things that make it closer, even though they were enemies and the Chinese, during the period of anti-Japanese war movies, there were plenty of anger at Japan that was expressed on the streets and trashing of Japanese tours in China. I think that a lot of Chinese tourists, when they go to Japan and they see the signs in Chinese characters, and maybe a little different characters, but there's a certain familiarity in Buddhism. So I think that there are cultural ties, so that when Chinese tourists the last few years have been going to Japan, I think in 2018 there were something like 8 million Chinese tourists. And when they go there, they say, hey, the Japanese are very polite. They're not like those soldiers we saw in those movies. They're very polite. The place is orderly. It's clean. They've already reached a comfortable way of life. This isn't such a bad place. So I think in terms of the image that a lot of people have of Japan, once they get rid of the World War II image, and look at Japan today, it doesn't seem so bad. And I think the Japanese have figured out a way to learn and live with the Chinese somewhat better than we Americans. I'm just talking kind of average. Of course, there are a lot of exceptions and all these rules, but I think what I'm describing, I think, is a different attitude.
Great. A very timely question, especially considering where we are right now in this COVID world, and with President Trump keep using China virus in public. Seems that the world is blaming China for hiding during the COVID outbreak in China, and it seems that there's a lot of hate associated with the virus and how China handles the virus. What do you think should Chinese government do to improve the impression from the world, especially after this COVID thing?
I'm not a specialist on this topic, but I try to follow it. And from what I hear, from December of last year until January, the leaders in China did not do all they could, as quickly as they could, to notify World Health Organization and world others. There were some steps they took, and of course China now is trying to give out publicity about how much they communicated. But as nearly as I can tell from the most objective accounts of foreigners who are familiar with the situation, there were cases in which China was not quick in passing on. I think in terms of individual groups of Chinese who helped out Americans get masks and get other kinds of equipment, I think that was extremely helpful. It hasn't got as much publicity as it should, But I think there are a lot of local areas who appreciate that individual Chinese groups have played a very constructive role in trying to get equipment to Americans. And what I would do at this point, I think, to come on about what was going on in December, January, and do it completely. I think sooner or later, the Western, or enough Westerners who have enough concrete data that to try to disguise all the things that happen. I think it's better to admit that some mistakes were made in China as well as in the United States, and to then develop credibility I think that would be more effective. And put another way, I think the Chinese propaganda department has found ways to tell stories and assume that becomes a dominant story within China. And that has succeeded pretty well in China. But I think that we Westerners are used to more open discussion. We aren't, if there's going to be evidence, we aren't going to, China can occasionally hide evidence about June 4th or what happened in the Cultural Revolution or in the Great Leap Forward. There are some people in propaganda department can hide evidence and be quiet about it, but that doesn't work on the outside. And I'm not sure it can work in the long run in China either, because now so many people are in touch with the outside that people going to China have to be careful because they have to protect themselves. But I think it's very hard to expect that propaganda department's effort to keep things quiet can convince people, and certainly when they go abroad, I think there are going to be foreigners who are going to find evidence that's very cannot be denied. That's going to show that some of the things the propaganda department says is not true. So I think in the long run, it would be better if the propaganda department admitted things, because I think in the whole wide world, there's so many people trying to find out that I think it would be wiser in the long run. It would get more difficult in the short run, but I think as a long run strategy, it would be a better strategy.
Thank you so much, Professor Vogel. I know we're getting close to the clock, but I do see one more question, which I think is very, very interesting, and it probably will leave us with some food for thoughts. And it says the relationship between East and West seems to be like Mac versus Windows. Now, given the contrast in the two mindsets, what would you say is the number one misunderstanding between East and West?
I don't think it's that simple. I mean, to me, there's so many different kinds of Chinese and so many different kinds of Americans that I don't think it can be put down into one thing. The thing I just mentioned, I think, is one thing that's a very wide difference, and that is the propaganda department tries to present one side of the story, and it's a correct story, and they don't allow people to question, and people are supposed to behave. That has brought some kind of order. And I think in the United States, until now, we have been able to bring the country together by having everybody express their opinions. I think the United States is now so much, I think the United States is maybe extreme, but I think many Western countries are similar in the sense that we want things to get out and open. Everybody says whatever they think and what they want, and express their idea. I think the United States now, during the Trump era, we're so divided and we're so quarrelsome that we're going to have to find some better way to handle things. And I think that China, which also now keeps order by keeping down outside opinions and by clamping down on people, I think that's going to be in trouble in the long run, because when you're in contact with the world, I think your new opinions will come in, and that effort to keep things quiet, I don't see how it can last. So I suppose if I had to say one common difference, that's it, that China now tries to keep order by keeping things under control and not allowing a lot of wild differences. And we have allowed people to say and do what they want, but are also having trouble now trying to keep our country together. Well, all those are musings of an old guy who has seen a lot of things in the course of his history and really wants, I have so many good Chinese friends and I so much want our countries to get along better. And I think all of you can be helpful. You have a lot of friends, I'm sure, in China, relatives maybe, but friends, and a lot of friends in this country who are not Chinese. And I think all of us have a role in trying to make it work. So I very much appreciate the chance to appear before you, and I very much appreciate your chance to let an old man tell it like he sees it.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Vogel. I do wish we could have another hour to talk about this. I know there are so many questions we haven't addressed, and I also apologize. I know some of the attendees, you wanted to invite your friends to our seminar, but unfortunately, we just quickly reached our upper limits. We have 520 people coming today, which is a wonderful success. So do apology, and thank you so much for everyone who's attending tonight. And for those who do want to follow us, I just wanted to do a very quick plug. We are New England Chinese American Alliance. We are hosting a series of our what we call distinguished speaker series, like featuring Professor Vogel. And there will be a number of other seminars that we will be hosting in the future. So we really look forward to seeing all of you in our future events. With that note, I just wanted to conclude our event tonight by saying a big thank you to Professor Vogel. Thank you so much for your time. And thanks very much for our co-chairs, our board members who's, helping to make this event happen today. And with that, good night to everyone. And for those who joined.
I want to say I thank you for the opportunity. I think your organization is doing a wonderful thing. And we wish you to succeed. It's good for you and it's good for us.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And good morning for anyone who joined from Asia. And good night, everyone here in the U.S. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Be safe. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.